So one of the most common causes you might have heard about for back pain on the bike is when the handlebars are too long or too low in their position. And so when we have to reach too far to the bars, that's actually going to take our torso angle and it's going to tip us forward. And that creates too much lumbar flexion. And so we end up with strain right back here in the lumbar spine. Now, this isn't always the case, though. One cause you don't hear too much about is when somebody is moving into too much hip flexion. And so if we run this and follow the actual hip and see how much hip flexion we move into, the more this femur comes up, the more hip flexion we're going to come into, and also the more torso flexion we end up in, the more this hip closes as well. And so these are linked together, that's for sure. But there have been times where I've had clients where actually their torso position here was actually okay. It had more to do with how high up this femur came, and that was actually the main problem and the biggest driver of the problem. Now you might be asking, how can we have someone move into less hip flexion without changing the torso here, without actually bringing them more upright? And we actually can adjust things from the other end. So instead of moving the torso up, we can actually bring the femur down. And how do we do that? We do that with a shorter crank. Because as this foot gets lower, and when we're able to take this foot from its position here, and instead instead of being way up there, it's down here, that's going to actually drive the knee from here down a little lower, and it's going to open up that hip flexion just a little. So now this begs the question, why does too much hip flexion lead to trouble in the low back? Well, it's because when we move into hip flexion and that knee comes up further, if we are moving past the point where the hip can move easily, we essentially move outside of what I call sort of our easy middle range, then we're going to transfer that force from the motion of actual hip flexion actually into the lumbar spine, and there's going to be some movement at the lumbar spine itself. Now, another, and I think sometimes more overlooked reason is that when we move into more hip flexion, it's actually, the more we do so, it actually gets more and more difficult for the abdominal muscles to do their work and to stabilize things, and their main job is to stabilize for the lumbar spine. And so you move into hip flexion every pedal stroke repetitively, and what happens is each time when you're moving into too much flexion, the abs sort of shut off, or at least they don't stabilize as well, and we get some more uncontrolled movement through the lumbar spine because of that. Now, I should note that this doesn't always just translate from being too aggressive on the bike or leaning too far forward. And certainly it's not always an option for everybody to change crank lengths to bring that leg down. But it's also important to note that you can actually develop low back pain on the bike because you're actually too upright. And again, it's for that same reason. Sometimes when you're too upright, also the lumbar spine really isn't able to be stabilized by our abdominals, and we end up with we would be better off being a little bit more aggressive in our positioning, a little bit further forward. We can really make use through some of the lat muscles that kind of help work in conjunction with the abdominals to help stabilize things. And sometimes just getting a little more aggressive will help accomplish that. If you're having back pain, you might take a look at, first of all, that amount of hip flexion that you move into. It is something to look into at times as far as crank length, to make sure you don't have too long of a crank on the bike. And one last thing, you can also be moving into too much hip flexion when the saddle is too low. When we're squatting, that actually can cause the hip for us to move up into too much hip flexion. So you also, a really simple change would be to adjust saddle height. Especially if it's a little bit on the low side, you can actually decrease that hip flexion by moving it up a little bit. That's all I have for this one. Thanks everyone for hanging in there. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below, and just know that if you like this sort of thing, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe. I actually produce 2 videos a week. One goes up onto YouTube and the other goes onto Patreon. If you want to support me there, that's great. Those videos will make their way onto YouTube. However, it'll take about 6 weeks for that to happen. But that's all I have. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye.